Good morning, and welcome to the Atlantic Council on this eve of the Memorial Day weekend. Thanks very much for coming. I'm Steve Grundman, the Lund Fellow for Emerging Defense Challenges here at the Council. I'm the producer of our Captains of Industry series, which Steve Gaffney is here to address. Our purpose is to hear his address. Steve is the chairman and CEO of DynCorp International. His address is entitled The Role of Service Contractors in the U.S. and Around the World. This address will be the 7th event in this series, the purpose of which is to make available a preeminent platform from which senior executives whose businesses contribute to national security can address the public interests that their companies serve and the public policies that shape their markets. Steve exemplifies the kind of public-minded business leader this series is designed to feature. Indeed, it was in part with a view to the occasion of Memorial Day that Steve accepted our invitation to participate in this series. While Memorial Day is a time to reflect upon and give thanks for the men and women in uniform who have served and especially sacrificed, it is no less an occasion to honor and memorialize civilians who have served and sacrificed alongside our forces, most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I know Steve will use a part of his remarks this morning to amplify that occasion. At the same time, Steve is also the ideal person to continue the conversation about the challenging business of federal services contracting that has been a recurring theme of this series. A series that we launched in October with an address by the Chief Executive of Excelis, Dave Melcher, which was then followed by appearances from Linda Hudson, who was then the Chief Executive of BAE Systems, Inc., by Ellen Lord, the Chief Executive of Textron Systems, Dave Zillett, who leads the federal services business of Computer Sciences Corporation. And then just last month, we had 2 addresses in this series, one by General John Jumper, the CEO of Leidos. Then on April 30th, Tom Enders, the Chief Executive of Airbus Group, who was also in town to receive that evening the Atlantic Council's Award for Distinguished Business Leadership. I'm going to mention, to plug a couple of these events in the next month. So following Steve's address today, Gwynne Shotwell, who's the President and Chief Operating Officer of SpaceX, will be on this stage on the 4th of June. And Bill Lynn, former Deputy Secretary and now the Chief Executive of Finmeccanica North America and DRS Technologies, he will be here on the 12th of June. In a moment, I'll have the pleasure of having the chairman of the Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, General Jim Jones, come to the podium to introduce Steve. But first, I'd like to take just a moment to summarize the particular impetus for the Captains of Industry series, which is twofold. First, there's the recognition that the marketplace of defense business is a vital thread in the overall fabric of U.S. national security and the national security of its allies in the Atlantic Alliance and partners around the globe. The second impetus for this series is the recognition that that vital thread in national security has reached an inflection formed by the confluence of several contemporary changes in the landscape of the industry, of which I'll mention a few just briefly. Fiscal crisis, the fact that while receding from more than a decade of counterinsurgency wars, our allied militaries still face new and novel challenges, not least on the eastern front of Europe most recently. And also the astounding advances in technology, which are, if not literally, then nearly so on the front page of the paper every day in various manifestations. And finally, it can be said that investors in the defense industry are sounding a new impetus for how companies tethered solely to defense budgets will create value against the headwinds of slow growth. The Captains of Industry series is an initiative, as I've said, of the Council's Scowcroft Center. It's a further expression of what its namesake, General Brent Scowcroft, had in mind for this center. The Scowcroft Center is the home of the Council's longstanding attention to NATO, but now also the regional and functional security challenges facing the U.S., its allies, and partners around the globe. As I said at the outset of this introduction, companies that design and build innovative products and services are an important part of the U.S. and allied response to the national security challenges our societies face. It is only fitting, therefore, that the Scowcroft Center should want to host a series that features the voices of business leaders who address these very concerns from their perspectives. Underscoring this rationale, I now want to invite to the stage Jim Jones, the chairman of the Scowcroft Center, to introduce Steve Gaffney. General Jones is currently the president of Jones Group International, and his career in public service is exemplary. National Security Advisor to President Obama, Supreme Allied Commander at NATO and Commander of the U.S. European Command during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and not least, 32nd Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Among a long list of advisors and supporters who we here at the Atlantic Council have to thank for its growth and prosperity, General Jones's contributions stand out. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for coming here today to introduce our featured speaker, Steve Gaffney.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. And Steve, thank you for accepting this invitation. It's really great to be with you. Over the course of my public career, in and out of uniform, I've been privileged to witness firsthand the benefits of leveraging private sector ingenuity as an important instrument in support of our foreign and national security policy objectives. Greater U.S. investment and emphasis on global trade and commerce will have, I predict, a profound effect on U.S. influence and engagement abroad for the rest of this century. It will stabilize fragile regions. It could reduce poverty and eliminate the despair that fuels these insurgencies around the world. I believe that we are entering into a period where commercial diplomacy is an instrument of our foreign policy and where the private sector fills an increasingly important role as a means of augmenting our traditional diplomatic and military instruments of power. Companies like DynCorp International, expert in training, intelligence, logistics, and maintenance operations, are now vital for our forces' sustainment, survival, and success. They offer the skills and services provided by the private sector to the Department of Defense, to the Department of State, Department of Commerce, and other U.S. agencies with global reach and influence. And this is now beyond question with regard to this tremendous contribution. Yet the fiscal pressures of today's austere budget environment have created a new dimension in the national security landscape that affects both the public and the private sectors. And this forces all of us to overcome new, unfamiliar challenges while also presenting us with new, unexpected opportunities to refine, to reinvent, and to re-engineer previous practices to ensure the quality of the quality of our product meets and exceeds expectations. I am very pleased and honored that Steve is here today to talk about the role that companies such as DynCorp International have served and will continue to serve to enhance our nation's military readiness, to augment our diplomatic and economic efforts and our commercial efforts, and to extend the helping hand of friendship in support of those in need. Steve joined DynCorp International as chairman of the board in July 2010 and was named president and CEO in August of 2010 after more than 25 years of leadership experience in the defense industry. Previously, he served as a CEO of IAP Worldwide Services, Inc., a senior vice president of ITT Corporation, and president of ITT Defense Electronics and Services. Steve, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Atlantic Council, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks for doing that, Chairman. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming here this morning to hear what I have to say. I'd like to begin by just expressing my thanks and appreciation to the Atlantic Council, and in particular you, Steve. Thank you very much. And of course, General, those were some nice words, and I appreciate that. And seeing the list of leaders that have been here in the past, clearly I'm humbled, actually, to be among those. With the approach of Memorial Day, I'd like to not only talk about the role of the contractor in support of national security and foreign policy, but also talk about sacrifice. I think that's appropriate. Because we're all familiar with, and we stand in awe of the men and women of our military who do what they do to protect our freedoms, right? And we're also, we feel the same way about the diplomatic officials who do the same thing. And we think about, our state and local law enforcement who actually do the same thing. And we think about the first responders and the firefighters and those who help us locally in the same regard. They do great things for us. And But there's another group that actually supports the mission as well, and also sacrifices. And even though their service and sacrifice is now integral part of the mission cadence of the United States government and agencies, sometimes their service and sacrifice is not as easily celebrated. And so that's why I thought it would be appropriate for me to come here before Memorial Day to talk about that. You know, on July 2nd of last year, about 4:30 in the morning, hundreds of DynCorp International employees were woken when terror struck the compound that they lived. The location was Afghanistan. The event was a vehicle-borne IED. It detonated, breached the wall of the compound where they were living, and destroyed most of the living quarters. It actually provided an opening for the insurgents to come through wearing suicide vests, you know, trying to actually cause more harm. So shocked and confused, as you could imagine, members of our team and other companies leapt into action. Some placed their own lives in harm's way to actually block the insurgents from doing more harm. You know, some, you know, ran across, you know, open ground, exposing themselves to other hostile fire, helping colleagues. Some went building to building, looking for survivors, seeing if they need help. And some took the grim task of collecting those who could not be saved. So those targets were employees of our company who were mentors, actually trying to help Afghanistan establish their own security capacity. They were actually trying to help that country develop a rule of law. I've talked to many who were there that day, and their reaction is pretty consistent. You know, they really didn't talk about, you know, it was bad luck that they were there that day. They talked about it and said, this is what we do. We actually, you know, try to make a difference in everything that we do, and they talked about the event with total professionalism. And then again on February the 10th of this year, tragedy struck again when a vehicle-borne IED struck a convoy that was carrying members of our team outside of Kabul, Afghanistan. 2 members of our training team were killed and a lot more injured. And after the attack, I got to speak to the convoy commander. So this was the gentleman who was responsible for the actual caravan taking our employees to and from their work site. And it was he who actually got to look into the eye of the terrorist as he was fumbling for his detonator switch. It was an interesting conversation to have for me. And although he was saddened by the loss of his friends, he didn't talk to me about that. He didn't talk to me about the fear that he had. He didn't talk to me about, you know, regretting that he was there. Instead, he talked to me about the sense of pride that he felt because he saw that very same Afghan, you know, police officer that just, you know, a week or a month ago he was help training. He saw firsthand that they arrived on the scene, that they actually established order, and they did what they needed to do to help preserve peace. And when he talked to me, he also had this sense of pride that he felt, you know, for the first time, hey, I'm making a difference, you know, in this world, and that was key. To date, we have lost, as a company, 71 of our employees who were taken from us way too early while serving customers' missions, and I would say serving our mission. It won't surprise you to learn, you know, that yes, some of those missions are actually in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we're a company whose roots go back to 1946. So more often, our missions are in other places as well. Places like California, in 2013, there was probably about 7,200 wildfires that burned up about 120,000 acres of land. This year, there was about another 1,000 fires to date, with another 2,300 acres or so burned up. And so I'm proud, to be part of a company that actually has our pilots and our maintenance officers actually taking part in the CAL FIRE program. And when they hear the call, they jump into their aircraft and they head directly into those fires, just trying to make a difference, trying to save lives. So moving from the wildfires of California to the gunfires of South America, our aerial counter-narcotics team, they take hostile fire from the enemy actually more frequently than in Iraq and Afghanistan. These spray aircraft are routinely fired upon. And in fact, over the last 5 years, there's probably been 600 different events. And yes, our personnel actually place themselves in harm's way, but most of our employees, if not all, they have an awareness that they are actually making a difference in the missions that they provide. And finally, we all know that the 89th Air Wing of the Air Force, their job is, they're responsible for the worldwide airlift mission that handles our president, our vice president, combatant commanders, officials throughout the government. And beginning in 2001 and actually continuing through today, we've been the only company that actually is supporting that mission 24 hours a day in a worldwide sense. And so when it comes to supporting the aircraft that fly some of our senior-most leaders in our country, clearly there's a requirement of absolute excellence. And we're proud of the fact that for 14 years, we've been doing a pretty good job, and we've won 11 FAA Diamond Excellence Awards, and we've actually done a good job protecting some vital assets. So for the DynCorp International team at the Joint Base Andrews, doing the right thing, performing in such an excellent way is just daily management. So I think you would all agree that, whether it be ensuring the safety of our highest officials of our government, or it's stemming the flow of narcotics around the world, or putting out forest fires that are affecting the lives of so many. This type of work is pretty incredible, and you would think the barriers to entry to do that work are pretty high, and the risks, as I described, are pretty high as well. So with that, I would just like to give you a backdrop of what the economics might look like in that space. And first, let me just say, remember that the U.S. government has already made these policy decisions to outsource some of these contract-specific services to private sector, as Steve mentioned, as did the General, because it made sense. It's because the government believed that through the use of Lean Six Sigma and continuous improvement initiatives in the private sector, there could be a better value provided. And while many may still be stuck on the days of the $500 hammer and the $1,000 toilet seat, the reality of this space is actually quite different. And so what I want to do is I want to actually give you a compare to some other industries that may exist. So according to data compiled either by NYU or S&P or even the Federal Reserve, we talk about financial metric, we talk about earnings before interest and taxes as something that we care about, right? EBIT. For instance, if you were in the newspaper business, and I think there's some here today, you would probably be making about 16% EBITDA margin. And if you were in the beverage industry, sodas, you'd probably be making just higher than 20% EBIT. And if you're in the entertainment industry, about 23%, and broadcasting actually about 27%. So knowing this, you would think that a comparable margin for a high-risk work, you think, where would that rack and stack? Well, it might surprise you to know that our EBITDA margins are probably in the mid-single digit, 5, 6, 7%. And again, that's before interest and taxes. I'm not complaining. I'm just trying to actually, compare this business, because as I've already stated, the majority of our employees, they actually, they're not doing it, I'll say, for the pay. Of course, they have to get paid, but they're doing it because they actually believe, that they're making a difference, in our world. And with 70% of our employees as veterans, and the other part, the ones I talk to, are really just, wanting to be part of something bigger than themselves. That's what makes the difference for us. As the General pointed out, in the United States, we've been facing some challenging times. We have some political gridlock. We have the fiscal problems that we have and challenges every day. And for a company that actually receives that 96% of our revenues actually come from the President's discretionary budget, relying solely on the United States government work, I don't think is truly a viable growth strategy. But at the same time, we're seeing that commercial companies, the commercial sector, is recognizing the value offered by service companies like ourselves, not just because we might be lower price, but because we actually have a best value offering. And around the world, for initiatives where the U.S. previously provided the funding, our allies are seeing the need to step up and fund their own national security and foreign policy objectives. So think in terms of aviation maintenance, air operations, logistics support, supply chain, intel solutions. And they need to do that quickly. And so you say, well, why quickly? Well, you just have to, read the daily newspaper and to figure that out. So you have, consider Iran. A historic handshake between President Obama and President Rouhani last year at the UN General Assembly. That led to around-the-clock negotiations. And last November, President Obama announced a deal. And it was just a 6-month deal, but it had interesting repercussions around the world. We know that the Israeli Prime Minister had some words to say about the deal. We also know that it's no secret that Saudi Arabia had been somewhat concerned and extremely frustrated over those negotiations. And according to various media reports, one of the unintended consequences of that nuclear deal may in fact be a Middle East buildup of security capability. And also with sanctions being lifted on certain countries, many Gulf nations we're seeing, or at least they're talking about, increasing their defense budgets and purchasing advanced weapons and actually to handle their own security in the region. So if you look at some of the numbers, Saudi Arabia, who in 2013 may have spent $53 billion a year, is over the next 5 years is taking that number up to $77 billion, or about an 8% growth rate. If you're looking at the UAE, they're talking about a 5% growth rate as well. And similarly, that it's no secret that China's rapidly growing their military capability, and that's creating a concern in the Asia-Pacific region. They stated that they would like to spend about $250 billion on defense by 2015. And we were all well aware that the United States recently announced a pivot to Asia. But because of budget issues and other things, challenges in order to get that pivot going, nations, I think, in the Asia-Pacific region are investing in their own security as well, just like is happening in the Middle East. Japan announced after years of declining defense budgets that they intend to invest about $240 billion over the next 5 years, 5% increase to what they were talking about. In fact, throughout the entire Asia-Pacific region, other nations are also talking about expanding their spend. And you have some countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia talking about a double-digit, increase. And even the new Abbott government is moving to implement campaign promises to boost defense. And then there's Russia and what was going on in Europe. So how will that new aggression take shape, and what will be the response? Many of those countries in the region have relatively small defense budgets, and I'm sure that they're rethinking what they need to do. And in fact, even experts like Steve Gaffney has talked about the fact that they anticipate an extraordinary, outlay in spending relative to training and equipment in order to defend against Russia is possible. So given that global picture, while the U.S. government may have the luxury of utilizing, let's say, untested, suppliers of based solely on price, I think this new customer set that I just described is looking for partners who have actually been doing the business for a long time. They're looking for partners that actually know how to mobilize quickly to deliver a service offering with near perfection. And they're looking for partners that can quickly help them build capacity inside their nation that they could depend on for years to come. So it's no coincidence, that in 2013, inside my company, we talked and actually executed a strategy to create a business unit called DynGlobal to somewhat address that need. And DynGlobal's intent was to spend 100% of their energy focused on commercial and international markets. And as you know, diversification, particularly a two-step adjacency from where you're working, is simple in theory, but really hard to do. And if you're familiar with the Bain study, which I'm a big fan of, it talks about the probability of success for a company to actually get a couple steps away from their core. The probability of success is somewhere down in the 20% range. So it's because of those odds that I believe, that companies really need to identify and understand what is their core, what are they good at, and once they do that, grow from it. And this is key to what we've done at DynGlobal. So we took, a look at what things can we do exceptionally well: training, aviation, maintenance, logistics support, and bring those to similar customers, but maybe change the contracting mechanism. So instead of it being US funded, it will become commercially funded. So we're not reinventing the wheel, we're just really offering our service offering using a different channel. So the core of this new business is staffed and up and running, and I expect great things over the next few years. So all of this really comes back to the concept of service and sacrifice. So when I look at how the world has changed and where I think it's going, I believe contractors will actually play a much more, a bigger role in supporting the U.S., its allies, and other friendly nations to help them protect the concept of a better tomorrow, and actually, more importantly, I think, to help them develop an organic capability to provide the the service and infrastructure that they need in the ever-changing world. So while our industry has fundamentally been focused on the U.S., the global circumstances have changed. And I expect to see more and more companies looking abroad at what our allies need and try to become partners there. But the motivations, I think, are the same. Help these countries position themselves for a better tomorrow. But I think the players have shifted somewhat. The U.S. has historically led the way and footed the bill, around the world. But now I see the need for others to step up and fill that void as the U.S. looks inward at budgets and deficits and other political challenges that we face. So where our personnel, our employees, were most often found alongside members of the U.S. military and State Department officials around the world, they are now just as likely to be working alongside militaries and governments of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and others, and the list goes on and on. And this is not new to us. We have been operating internationally for decades, and I think it's a sweet spot for us. But now it's more deliberate and a more dedicated part of our strategy. Ours is an industry that I'm particularly proud to be part of because it demands more of each of us, because the missions that we serve, I think, take on a higher need. This week we have a number of members of our DI family here in D.C. to actually attend the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors Memorial Day weekend Good Grief Camp. And for those of you who are not familiar with TAPS, I encourage you to get to know them, and please find it in a place in your heart to pledge some support. They do great things. And in fact, the founder of TAPS, Bonnie Carroll, is here today, and I appreciate that, Bonnie, you being here. TAPS is an organization that actually helps families who have lost a loved one while he or she was serving. And importantly, it's one of the few organizations that not only assists military, but also contractors. So DI, we signed a partnership with TAPS not too long ago, pledging our support to do what we can to help all families who have lost a loved one in service. As the wife of one of our employees wrote me earlier this year, a young person who had just gave birth to their first son, she said, I'm proud to say that Michael worked for a company that partnered up with TAPS to make sure that contractor families don't get pushed under the rug. All too often, people forget that you don't have to be in this service to serve. Many people overseas are contractors who were prior military members, and they say, and they, as well as their families, need just as much support. So it's with her words in mind that Memorial Day looks a little different for us at DI. It's clearly a sacred day of remembrance when we honor those who gave their lives while serving our country, sacrificing everything to protect and defend the freedoms that we hold so close to our hearts. But on Monday, not only will I be thinking about the men and women in the armed services, but I'll also be thinking about the contractors who gave their all. I'll be thanking them for all that they do, all that they did. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to me here this morning. Is that okay?
Perfect. So if you sit right there. Thank you very much, Steve. For a series that I think I can quote my mission statement from heart, whose purpose is to hear business leaders talk about the public interests that their companies serve and the public policies that shape their markets. I I can hardly imagine an address more befitting that mission than the one we just heard from you. And I especially appreciate, indeed, sincerely, the reminder of the service and sacrifice of this whole other cadre of heroes that Memorial Day gives us the occasion to remember. So I appreciate that. Tagging on to that point, I want to thank Bonnie Carroll from TAPS for being here today. And I know there are others of you in the audience whose interest in the event today stems, at least in part, from that motivation. And I thank you all also for being here. You know, what we're going to do here is have a conversation from now until perhaps as late as 11:45. I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator to start that conversation because I already have a list of questions that I want to ask Steve. But rest assured, I will, within just a few minutes, turn to the rest of you in the audience to participate in this conversation. I'll remind everyone that this is a fully public, on-the-record event. We are indeed live streaming it. And my colleagues would want me to remind that we are live tweeting it under the hashtag ACCOI. Did I get that right, Alex? You did. Okay, there. And indeed, we might even, I will solicit questions from those of you who may be following with access to Twitter. My colleague Alex will take questions that you may want to pose to Steve Gaffney over Twitter. And if it's a really good one, he'll bring me a note and I'll ask it. You know, the range of questions that came to my mind as you were talking really spans national security strategy to business strategy. And so I'm going to try a question from maybe each, 3 spots on that spectrum. I know you traveled to Afghanistan because you have a big operation there, and I know you have important business leaders in your own company who were there. And I am interested from those experiences and reports in your sense of the situation in Afghanistan. You know, in the public conversation about the end of our operation and the transition from combat operations to a strictly support operation, I still get the sense from wherever we are, 6,000 or 10,000 miles away, that there is not a very strong consensus of knowledge about what is the situation there in terms of security. Let's start with security and governance. So while I grant it may be taking you slightly outside your mandate as the chief executive of DynCorp, I think you and your company have a lot of tactile exposure to the question, and I'd be interested in what views you want to add to it.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and of course, I could you know, go in a dozen different areas. But let me just say this. We've been in both Iraq and Afghanistan since the beginning. Our company does both aviation support as well as primarily most of the training of the police force there. And I had an opportunity to meet a lot of those candidates who were working their way through the process and the leadership of the Afghanistan police departments. And all I can tell you is they're so grateful that we're actually there, you know, trying to help them be able to put the foundation in place in their country so that they could have a secure, you know, safe tomorrow. Clearly, it's a country that has its challenges, both politically and other. I can suggest to you that the folks that we employ, the people that we employ from Afghanistan, great values and good work ethic and want to make a difference for their country going forward. They're hopeful that we will continue to support as the United States will continue to support the journey that they're on. So they as a long period of time to help them do the things that they need to do in order to have an infrastructure that they could rely on.
Okay, thanks. The other question I want to ask actually was prompted first by General Jones's introduction, and then second by your underscoring the fiscal challenge, to put it euphemistically, on discretionary spending in the U.S. So your company, putting those two thoughts together, it feels to me like your company is right at the conjunction of two opposing trends, and right, you must be living this every day, so I'm not trying to make matters worse here, but actually draw out a judgment about what the long-term net of these things would be. And those two trends are, on the one hand, a national security strategy, either explicitly or of necessity, that increasingly involves the deliberate use of commercial interests and businesses such as yours to advance the foreign and defense policy interests of the United States. On the one hand, a trend line that seems to be growing. I think that was a part of the point that General Jones was making in his introduction. But on the other hand, a trend line of discretionary spending that is perhaps at best stagnant. Maybe worse, maybe a little better, but for the immediate future, stagnant. Where do you see, perhaps not in the near term, but in the longer term, say over 10 years, what's the net of those two things? I'm gonna make it worse here, or is your diversification strategy really a reflection of the fact that the net of those two things in the U.S. is not growth?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Had a board meeting only a few weeks ago, and safe to say, we talked about it for hours.
It's worth it, I think.
Yeah, and so I think you have to look at what a company's portfolio. You know, we have a piece of our portfolio that and the armed conflict issues. So as the surge over the last few years increased, we saw increases in our revenues. As the armed conflict de-escalates, we expect those gains, let's say, from a business point of view, to go down. We expect that. And so the real challenge is, can the other pieces of your business actually sustain some level of growth? You know, are you continuing to do the things that you need to do in order to serve other missions that are in the base budget, let's say? Now, the challenges that the industry is facing is fundamentally centered around, I think, sequestration, which I think changed the game overnight. And so just like the leaders inside the Pentagon, I'm sure, don't like surprises, or they like to understand, they like clarity. Investors on Wall Street, they appreciate clarity the same way. So the challenge is, how do you make sense of the changes that not only were you going to see a declining defense budget, but you saw the rules changed in basically with sequestration. So that's the challenge. I think over the long term, the services that companies like ours provide are still going to have to be provided over the long haul. It makes sense, you know, that during a declining, you know, budget phase, you know, the government will I think through what's really inherently governmental and stick to that, and those things that actually can be done by the private sector, you know, maybe more efficiently because of our continued investment in process improvement, that there will be a win-win situation. So I think over time, you know, you're still going to see this partnership. And I was just with the Pentagon's, the Vice Chief of the Army, he suggested that. I think, you know, so even though the budgets are going to come down, they're large budgets. and half the budgets you go to O&M, half of those O&M budgets go to outsourcing. So although the budgets are coming down, there's still a large budget. The challenge is to increase your win rate, take share from your competition, and we tend to be able to do that. I think the Dyn Global strategy is to take advantage of things have so drastically changed overseas, where they're literally spending more of their own money to do the things that used to be funded by the U.S. And because we've been in those countries for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, that will help offset some of the decline. And it just better position us for both the U.S. markets and the international markets.
Okay. Your point about taking share, I think those were your words, actually leads to the last question that I wanted to start the conversation with, and it's all the way down at the end of the spectrum of plain old business strategy, and that is, for a company like yours, what is innovation? What is it to innovate in a company like yours? The purpose, one anyway, of innovating tends to be to take share from competitors who are not innovating as well or as fast as you. But what does it mean in a business like yours to innovate?
Right. That's a great question. And that's probably the second question that gets the most of the time at the board meeting. 2/3 of my professional career were in hardware and product development. And what technology should you invest in? What
that's easy to imagine what innovation
Well,
is.
I say that's easy, right? Yeah. The real hard part, since our products are actually our people, the real differentiator for us is, can you put a value-based culture in place? Can you put a leadership development plan in place that touches the 20,000+ people throughout your company, where they actually come together and act as one, where they actually spend most of their time worrying about providing the service versus all the other things that that get in the way of team dynamics. So most of the differentiator in my mind is the people and the leadership that you have in your company. I spend a lot of time going through that. And the second thing is actually to be able to have a culture where you can actually confront reality. What works, what doesn't work. Most of the time in my career where I've seen inefficiencies, it's just hard to get to the discussion. Once you get to the issue, you can fix it. The challenge is getting to the discussion. So we try to build, we actually have a social contract concept inside of our company where we try to behave with one another. And so we could quickly get to the issues at hand faster than our competition might, so that we could adjust course and support the mission.
I can't help but observe how much that answer to my question sounds like the answers to a similar kind of question that we get from military commanders who take this stage, and we ask, what do you focus on? How do you make a difference in your units? It's the people and the processes.
That is.
It's perhaps not a coincidence that those two things sound so familiar. Okay, I have spent the first 3 rounds that I had. Are there questions here in the audience that you'd like to pose to Steve Gaffney? We'll start with Michael Bruno. Please, we are on the record, so I'd appreciate if you would clearly identify yourself when you actually wait for a microphone and then identify yourself before asking your question. Thanks, Mike, for coming.
Hi, Michael Bruno with Aviation Week and Space Technology. How do you see potential insourcing by the U.S. government and allies in the future in regards to business strategy? Is it something that you sort of accept and then try to find other lines of business, or do you try to fight that trend in Washington, or how do you approach it?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question. So let me tell you what we don't do. We don't fight it, okay? We're here to support the decisions that come out of the leadership of our government. But that's a great question. So, and we've lived through that debate, over the last few years again. And I can remember, we talked about that in the 80s and the 90s and what have you. I think there is a place where, once inherently governmental is defined, then those things should indeed be insourced because it's appropriate that they are. There's a significant amount of work, I think, that falls outside of that. We don't spend, Michael, a lot of time thinking or worrying about that, because the services that we provide, indeed, I think are comfortably, being contracted for. Internationally, the way I see it, where they need, our international customers, whether it's in the Emirates or in other countries, they embrace us open arms. They want us to be part of their leadership team. They want us to help them actually build the infrastructure to run, whether it be equipment depots or aviation support teams. And actually, so they're a little bit, let's say, behind the U.S. in terms of capacity, and their need is real, and their sense of urgency is high. And I think that's, so I think it forms a nice balance, if that was helpful.
I think I have a question right here in the second row.
Thank you very much. Otto Machida with the International Stability Operations Association. DynCorp does so many things, including intelligence services, support services. It seems to me the moniker of a defense company doesn't seem to do it justice. So I have kind of two questions. Do you consider yourself a defense company? And when you go in to meet with a new, or do you use a different moniker? And when you go in to meet someone who doesn't understand what DynCorp does, how do you explain what DynCorp does, and how do you differentiate yourself from the other competitors and other industry players in your industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we spend a lot of time thinking about, because we offer so many different services, you could quickly get caught up talking only about one thing versus all. I think we've evolved over the years. As I mentioned in my talk, we started, our roots go back to the late 40s. We tend to think today that we really are a solutions provider. We solve problems, not with with equipment per se, but with people, processes, tools, capabilities. We solve them in both aviation and overall general logistics. And we can do that whether it's a national security problem or a foreign policy or other. We just received a small contract where we're actually helping put in an ERP system into a region, needing some of the subject matter expertise that we have, being an equipment logistics player inside the military. So it's interesting. The demands are broad, and we're going to try to serve as many of those demands as possible.
Okay, I saw a question right on the back row, and then I'll come to Bonnie.
Yes, good morning, Lane Smith. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I actually worked for a congressional commission. I looked very carefully at your operations in southern Afghanistan. Question for you, the trafficking in persons challenge that I thought you dealt with well in southern Afghanistan, and your movement into some of the Middle East markets and so on, how would you see your company's approach helping to, I would say, modernize practices for importing labor into the Middle East? It's a serious, serious problem.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we take very seriously. So we spend a lot of time on it. Not only the tactics that you need to use in terms of the training, the flow down, the screening of the things of the companies we use, but also it's about making sure that the relationships we have with the companies in our supply chain think about the problem the same way that we do. So I don't know what the best practice looks like yet in CTIPS, but we're going to constantly try to find it. And when we find that best practice, we're going to adapt. And I think that's what any leader needs to do.
If I didn't think this was already a hard business to run, that question just compounds it in a way I wouldn't have anticipated. Bonnie Carroll.
Yes, Bonnie Carroll from the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. We are very proud of our longstanding relationship with DynCorp. Thank you so much for all that you do, and we appreciate the sacrifices made by the DynCorp team. I wondered if you could speak about the extraordinary efforts of your Family Assistance Program and the unique things that you do for the families of the fallen.
Yeah.
It makes a tremendous difference, and it's unlike any other company we've seen.
Yeah, Bonnie, that's a great question. And again, thank you for being here. As I mentioned, you know, we've had 71 of our employees paid the ultimate sacrifice. One of the things when I joined the company in 2010, I asked about was our employee assistance program. How do we do it? The work that we do shoulder to shoulder, you know, with the men and women of the military and other services, you know, we tend to have some of the same issues that you would see in the military, you know, and as I said, so how do we deal with that? And as you know, we have some of the best professionals I think I've come across. It's somebody who is focused on dealing with our employees, both from a traumatic stress point of view as well for any injuries. Actually, my daughter, who graduated as a social worker, she says, "Dad, I really want to come work, you know, for you." Be careful what you ask for, all right? But again, to help, you know, and learn, you know, what is it you can do to help people get through, you know, some of the issues that life brings them. You know, we spend the time, we train our folks. You know, next Friday, we have a Defense of Freedom Award ceremony where, you know, a dozen folks their families will receive the Defense of Freedom Awards. We make it an event. It's important to us, and we keep their memories near and dear to our heart and their families.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. There's a question right on the aisle in the third row, please.
Thank you very much. Nigel Sutton, Air Environment. Steve, thank you for your comments and your insights earlier. And you know, John Barr and I were just sitting here and we were talking about, you know, international. We're in an international spectrum here, and you mentioned Dyn Global, and I believe it's recently stood up. And just like us, we're trying to move from the export only to more global, international, multinational type sort of structure. And we face a lot of challenges, also in the commercialization market too. I was wondering what's keeping you up at night going into that area, and what's your challenges with that, and where do you see the opportunities in that too?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, I'm a firm believer that when a company tries to completely transform themselves and gets too far away from their core, I just don't think the probability of success is that high, and it creates, you know, there's lots of challenges. Especially going into a global environment where you have different cultures, different customs, you know, just different ways of doing business. So, so one of the things we did was we said, let's stand up a complete different structure whose folks, you know, whose core capabilities, whose training is all around doing business in those regions. Let's make sure we define what success looks like. We define what our social contract would look like, and never deviate from that. And when we partner with companies in those regions, you know, we make sure that we do a cultural integration, you know, that we believe in the same things, that we deal with transparency issues the same way, and if there's not a match in that area, we just say we're not interested. You have to be able to walk away. That's what a good leader needs to do sometimes. Yes.
Other questions? Right on the aisle in the third row here.
Thank you. My name is Jean Ling Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank you for your presentations and your presenting of the core and the values. I pick up from what you just said, that you're looking to integrate with culture local in the region where you'll be working at. So with the pivot to Asia, what is your next plan? Have you been ready to, or have you already been working with that? And the culture in Asia, when you're just talking about transparency, what if that doesn't work for the local, the regional culture? And then also recently, there's a lot of concern about IPR thefts, that we just know that the 5 PRA personnel has somehow copied your spatial techniques.
Yes.
So how would you protect ourselves from that?
Right. Well, again, cultural integration, I think, is probably the most difficult thing, right? Because it takes time, right? You can't rush, some of these relationships. And so having been doing business for upwards of 20 to 30 years in some of these regions, that's helpful for us. Now we also, when we go into regions, we want to actually look and act like a local company. So we form a Dyn Arabia, we form a Dyn Iraq, a Dyn Australia, and they're not led by U.S. entirely, right? They're actually led by folks who have grown up and in the regions, maybe have studied abroad, and that could help us, bridge those gaps. Because again, I'm one of those that believes I'm not going to know everything, and we're not going to know everything around the world, but we can find people that do, and we want to find those people, put them on our teams, and then do great things together. So hopefully that was helpful.
This reminds me of one of the other recurring themes in this series, which is people, which from the executives of, let's call them, to generalize, the hardware companies, has been nearly described as a brain drain, sort of a crisis of talent in the aerospace industry. Do you have a crisis of talent in the services industry? And where do you get your people? My guess is it's more interesting than simply former military officers.
Yeah. Well, again, people are important no matter what organization you run. Getting the right people is actually the goal. And I often talk, again, having grown up in the hardware area, have been part of the industrial base discussion for a long time. But now I talk about the industrial base, preserving the industrial base, even in the services side. So for instance, a few years ago, our company, we were putting 1,000 people a month into a project overseas, 1,000 people. To do that takes a significant amount of infrastructure to source, to screen, to train, to deploy. That is a huge logistics challenge. So as demand comes down, how do you keep that capacity? How do you keep that capability? The leaders that we have that are generally deployed to the projects, we've decided to invest in a cadre of leaders, and they're ours, right? They're DynCorp international employees, and we move them based on where the projects are, because that's the discriminator for us, is the leadership, as I mentioned early. Is it as difficult, so engineers, I'm an engineer, but, engineers are difficult because we don't graduate as many in the United States as we once did. The whole science and technology challenges that face a hardware company doesn't really affect us as much. However, getting the right experiences, experiential knowledge for us versus the academics are probably more important.
Yeah, very challenging jobs. Frank, second row here, please.
Hi, Frank Finelli with the Carlyle Group. Steve, thank you so much for your comments. I'm wondering, just looking back over your career and the changing landscape of the defense industry, could you talk a little bit about what you've seen from the M&A environment through ITT, IAP, and now at DynCorp, and what you see going forward in that regard?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. M&A, changing landscape. Well, we live in interesting times, right? So even though earnings may be down, multiples are pretty high. So that's a challenge today, and I think it will change, over the next few years, as some of the companies actually try to look at their portfolio, determine what their core really is, and then decide to divest. I've run multi-industry companies before that had both the hardware and services component. I'm very familiar with the debate that goes on inside the boardrooms about eroding margins and those types of things. Being a pure play services provider, I would like to remain opportunistic to take advantage of some of those decisions that might be made in those boardrooms. But over the years, there has been massive changes. If you just think about it from just a performance, in the 80s, it was a true, what I think, partnership with the government in terms of trying to get things done. And I actually believe some of the best weapon systems were defined and designed under a fixed price environment during those times. I think the 90s tended to be more of a total systems performance view. I'm not sure, many things. We had as many successes, and I think the relationship started to change a little bit. And the last 10 years or so has been hard to calibrate because we've been engaged in two wars. But I think the M&A activity is actually going to pick up over the next few years as boards look at their portfolio and figure out where to go forward. And I'm hopeful that we'll be opportunistic in there.
Actually, I want to tag on to that. We have just a few minutes left. I see one hand. I'm going to get another question in, and then we'll wrap up in about 5 minutes. Yours is a company that has transited an interesting, I suppose not unique, sequence of capitalizations. You're a public company now. You're a private equity-owned company once upon a time, not too long ago. I think a lot of boardrooms and even outside of boardrooms are thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of different styles of capitalization. You have any thoughts from DynCorp's experience as to, and I'm sure it's a kind of pros and cons that do you want to offer on that?
Well, again, so in 2010, I was one of the champions I convinced the private equity company to buy DynCorp International. That was public at the time.
Right.
So after the spinoff from CSC, we were private and then went IPO, and then in 2010, we took it. We don't have stock, but we have bonds. Mm-hmm. But our equity owner, I think, is the differentiator in our world, in DynCorp International. He is a patriot. He is someone who thinks about things in a long-cycled way. His intent is not to come in and out in a short period of time, but to invest what needs to get invested to actually support the needs of our country as best we can. And that's what I think is going to be a differentiator for us, is his view of what we do inside the marketplace. And I'm pretty hopeful that we'll be able to take advantage of that over the next few years.
Okay. So I will take this question in the third row, and then we will wrap up.
Hi, Lee Munsell with Politico. I was wondering, there was a DoD IG report that came out a couple days ago, an Inspector General report that's talking about potentially overcharging DynCorp and Northrop Grumman overcharge for hours working on some projects in Afghanistan. And there have been similar issues like that in the past. And so I'm wondering, partially based on your comments about working in the trenches side by side with the military, do you ever feel like the relationship is kind of tense because of that sort of thing? How do you work together when you're kind of fighting over nickels and dimes and specifics of contracts? But I also want to hear what you have to say about the reports as well.
Well, there was a few questions in there. You got your money's worth, right?
Go ahead. Pick the one you'd like to answer.
So again, with respect to the DoD IG report, I don't think it has officially come out, so I'm not going to respond directly to it. But I am familiar with the issue, and I'm here to tell you that I'm very confident that we did everything right, and that we'll be okay through that. With respect to, I think you touched on oversight, and what's the role? Look, we live in a regulated environment. We have rules, and in fact, that's what separates us, I think, a great deal from the commercial sector. And we take those rules very seriously, and I think it should be a healthy relationship between our auditors. At one time, 15% of my footprint in one of my buildings were government auditors. So a lot of folks live with us and to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So I'm okay with that. It's I'm thinking towards a future, where that we can be have even a better relationship than we have today. I don't think it gets in the way of the actual work getting performed. Our company is filled with professionals who have been doing this for a long period of time, and they understand the roles and the different phases that we are in the life cycle.
Well, I want to thank you very much. This your address and this conversation has done what this series is designed to do, which is to shed some light on and amplify the nature of doing business in national security, and again, your company, in ways that I certainly learned through this conversation, participates in that marketplace as interestingly and impressively as any that we've had here. So thank you very much. Thanks again, General Jones, for coming to make this introduction, and thanks to all of you for participating.